We are very excited to be here. Thank you for having us. We just thought we would start kind of virtual processing, virtual culture, and then some virtual tools that we recommend to our clients. Again, this is really just kind of brainstorming to get people start chatting and talking about questions. So obviously when we break down, when we're working with a lot of clients, especially over the last few weeks, small businesses and smaller nonprofits that we work with, it's overwhelming to think about what we can do virtually, what we can do remotely, and how to support their different team members. Because even in our own office, which I did have to come to the office today because of my bandwidth has been low at my house. If you saw my whole office, you would not believe that we are a paperless organization. We are a less paper organization, but until you're actually trying to work remote, I think people don't really realize how much paper they rely on. So I think this has been a huge learning curve for a lot of people, even that thought that they were doing things virtually. So we look at receipting, disbursements, reconciliation, and analysis. Obviously on the accounts receivable side, we did still have some people that are going into the office on a regular basis. So they're not fully remote. It might be once a week because the essential services of the business can still be done. So they can still do that. But there are so many processing systems, whether it's the receivables that is based on a cloud-based communication system. We now are recommending to people, if you have a person in the office, because you still have some, a lot of mail when people are transitioning during this time of crisis, one person is scanning in all of the mail and all of the information, obviously not all, I shouldn't have said that, vendor invoices, important communications, things like that, all of that scanned in. And then it's more like a filing cabinet in a cloud-based software. So then you have to figure out where it goes so that you can have effective communication. On the disbursement side, we've been working with clients for quite a long time to make sure that they can process things remotely. Obviously moving to remote databases, we're moving to remote accounts payable systems, making sure that you've got the cloud-based accounting software in the first place so that you can access it remotely. But within most of the accounts payable modules that we work with, there's the workflow built into it. So specifically for smaller organizations, if you have clients or if you work with your team and you are so used to handing over an invoice for signature because auditors want to see all of that approval, there's a lot of systems that just virtually record all of those workflow and all of those different approval levels. From a reconciliation perspective, all of that, again, can be done remotely. I do know a lot of accountants and controllers and CFOs even that when they're looking at bank reconciliations or whatever else, it still is kind of like that, I used to call it my banky when I was little, like your comfort level, your holding blanket, that was just, I want to see that bank statement next to me so I can tick it off, things like that. There still is that comfort level, but if you have the software to do it, it makes more sense to do it online, and then you're clicking a box instead of doing things in duplicative processes. And then the analysis side of things, we'll talk about in just one second about some of the tools that we use and best practices that we have, but we definitely recommend, whether it's a Google site, a Microsoft site, a Box site, there are certainly ways that you can record all of the different approval processes and who's looking at the analysis. So you're sharing screens instead of having, 5 copies of the financial statements with the analysis next to them. It's really a shared document in a shared space. But again, receipting, disbursements, we recommend that workflow be built in, reconciliation and analysis. So again, like I said earlier, we're going virtual processing to virtual culture. Katie?
Yes, so in regards to the culture that might have been, I know technology was a big shift, figuring out processes was a big shift, and then of course the change in culture. And I think that this is going to continue to be something that we are focusing on, at least internally, just because of course it's something that so many of us are new to. So as I mentioned, or as was mentioned earlier, we had 2 full tax department staff go remote for the first time in the fall, and we did have some adjustments then, and then there was nothing compared to it when we all went and had to learn pretty much what those 2 individuals had gone through. So from a communication perspective, we have from the beginning had said that over communicating is the best way to go. So you can't really over communicate too much, or you can't over communicate, I guess, to some extent. because you are no longer able to see those individuals, right? So you don't have that person in the chair. You can't walk down the hall, and you don't just have a general sense on how someone's doing. And so we're communicating frequently, often. We've set up some consistent communication guidelines on, at the very start when we all went remote, we did have check-ins on a daily basis, a 15-minute check-in call for the whole group. Mind you, there was a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't end up speaking. So we learned quickly that that might not be the best approach. And so we have gone, since then, we did start utilizing Teams in the fall, and we do have a lot of communication through the Teams app from our perspective on Microsoft Teams. Again, if we had not started utilizing Teams, I don't know where exactly we'd be, and same with Skype, but for the most part, we've tried to eliminate any need for constant emails, or to Sarah's point about redoing a document several times over. We are trying to have one place in SharePoint or Teams where that's a single document, a place of reference, and making certain that we're communicating the same way. So when it comes time to find the thing that you had talked about, where it is that you're looking for it at. And then in terms of communication guidelines, we've talked a lot about what way does it make the most sense to have the communication. So I've just recently gone through a bunch of goal meetings with all my staff, and we've talked about how being remote has caused, again, we use Microsoft Teams. We previously used Skype, but you are now typing a lot of comments, right? So there's a lot of texting and typing back and forth to have the conversations with staff and other offices. And I've really pushed on, just because we are not physically in the office anymore doesn't mean you can't pick up the phone or go through Teams and have a conversation. It's still so much faster than typing stuff out. From a typing perspective, at least you have the history there. But it does take a lot of time. People overthink and reanalyze and erase and retype the thoughts that they're going to have, as opposed to a conversation. It just goes, it's much quicker and more natural, I guess I would say. And same thing with the video. So I've also started requesting people turn their videos on. A lot of people don't like to do that. We all understand that we're all in this together. Most of us have not worked from home, or have worked from home very infrequently. And so, having the cat walk by, or the dog show up, or a kid walk in the room, or a stomp on the floor, or whatever it might be, or maybe you don't have your hair done that day. We've really been trying to encourage people that it's okay that any of that stuff happens, because we're all going through it. It happens to all of us, or technology might not work that day. So honestly, being truly understanding with the staff. I know even personally, when we first went remote, I felt like I had to respond to a message the minute it came through. Anytime something showed up, or a call, because I felt that how were they going to know? And even that's me, the head of the tax department. How are they going to know that I'm really working if I don't immediately reply to a message or answer the call at that second? And I realized that through all of this, that you really have to have a lot more trust in your department to make certain, to truly believe you're trusting in them, that they are doing what they say they're doing. So I might not get back to you that very second. It doesn't mean that I haven't worked that day, or I'm not working that minute. I certainly wouldn't think that if I walked by someone's office, in the office, and said, oh, they're not there, they are not even here today. That wouldn't occur to me. It would just be that they're in a meeting or away from their desk for a minute, not just that they're not doing anything. So, the culture's been different. We've been trying to encourage games internally. We are doing, and maybe I'll pause and get back to that in a few minutes, but overall, I guess those are the bullet points for now in terms of, just making sure we're still having those connections with individuals.
Yeah, I think we wanted to make sure that we put the virtual culture piece in, because even though we're talking about best practices for finance teams, the finance team it's still a team. We all still need to work together. And if you don't have that connection, that culture of understanding and everything that Katie just said, it becomes more clunky. As finance people, I think communication and process and checklists and everything, it's kind of in our blood. But when you are virtual, it can't necessarily be a checklist or a route slip that you take from desk to desk. So the over communication is key. The last thing that we've got on here is virtual tools. So best practices, we certainly recommend cloud-based accounting software. We had a lot of clients that even still are not real excited about cloud-based and they want server. So if that's the case, then you've just got to have remote access. I think those are kind of obvious ones out there, but like I said, we still have a lot of people even this week that were calling and saying, hey, we never did do cloud-based software, so we're on QuickBooks Desktop. What can we do now? We still have to go into the office once a week and process things, or I can only work when off of this one computer. And it is just something they haven't had to think about before. So just make sure that you're vetting out the different options for remote access, whether it's a VPN or there's some different, I am not a tech person. I call my tech person Easy Button for some of these things, but there are some free tools that you can go in to get remote access of different devices and computers that are really helpful. Katie mentioned Teams, so we use Office 365. We are a huge proponent of that because of all the tools and how relatively inexpensive that is for a lot of people. And I think it is so robust, even though it isn't free like some of the applications, it does have more tools that people don't even think about when they're looking at the expense. So if you want to get an Office 365 license, now you can do workflow planning. You can have the task list that you're assigning across your team. So you can integrate a lot of these virtual processes from an Excel document that we sign our initials on, or your team members sign their initials on, to a workflow that is moving the task back and forth. So again, even though there's a cost here, you're really reducing costs somewhere else. It's got obviously the remote collaboration space that Katie was mentioning to earlier, Teams going back and forth. There's video options. So it just has such a huge capability. And then Zoom is the other thing. I think I would be shocked if anybody really across the country that is in any form of business that hasn't been on Zoom in the last 3 weeks. It has really exploded. And one of the things that Katie, I think, was touching on when she was talking about games is the Zoom room. So within Zoom, you can really have fun party games with your teams, even though you might be remote. It doesn't matter if they're in Washington or Michigan. You just Zoom them to their room and they can have smaller conversations. Cloud-based work management systems obviously is very important, like Asana. So again, that is in Office 365, but there are also some other project management systems that are really, really useful tools. And then video. Again, Katie mentioned how important it is for communication, for empathy, so that we can still maintain those relationships that are vital in our organizations and in our finance teams. And that is it. So Chris and Ashley, I will stop share and turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. And what we wanted to talk about today really kind of is in parallel to that. So, given the changing environment that we're all currently in, the workforce is really having to adapt very quickly to social distancing, government orders to stay at home, and then applying all of those, external factors to how they still do their job. And so, we kind of look at this as really like, how do we respond? How do we recover? And then how do we go forward? How do we thrive? And so, our organization, we have built out a framework to essentially help companies look at what are the steps that we need to take today? What do we need to do tomorrow? And then what's a little bit down farther on the roadmap, so that, hopefully sooner rather than later, we get some semblance of normalcy within the working environment. But we do need to consider, like, what are the possible long-term impacts of COVID and working remotely? Has the delivery model of accounting and finance fundamentally changed? And so when we're thinking about that, if nothing else, COVID has really kind of called to the front issues for a lot of businesses that prevents them from effectively working in a remote environment. So in our framework, we kind of break this down into really kind of like, okay, well, let's respond and then let's execute. So under respond, we look at organizing. So what are the requirements that we have, the capacity, what are the leadership? So those are the issues around, getting a virtual closed schedule, outlining critical path activities, evaluating access. So, the VPN issue that commonly we work with businesses to, what are the capacities of VPN? Are they having difficulty accessing their information? And then, really kind of like looking at this from like a virtual command center. What does this change about your communication style and frequency of communications? Again, as you guys mentioned, Zoom, a lot of video calls nowadays. So honestly, I feel like we're having more face-to-face discussions now than possibly we were back when we were in the office. So that's just another thing to consider, is like, how does this change our interaction with each other? And, you know, like you guys mentioned, and like Ashley will kind of talk to, we need to kind of think about, like, this does change a little bit of our culture, you know, being in the home. If kids aren't at school, now you're wearing two hats at the same time. So one of, you know, caretaker of your home, but also having to do your day job. And so after we kind of organize and just like, let's identify and assess our current situation, let's prepare for what we have to do, because at the end of the day, you know, the finance accounting schedule does not stop, right? So let's look at the ability for us to execute. Do we need to look at resourcing, accessibility, and then think about controls within our systems too. So security obviously being a big thing. I'm sure everyone has seen within the news recently, Zoom in particular, you know, not to call out Zoom, I know we're on a Zoom call right now, but making sure that you do have proper security controls around Zoom, right? You've seen the what they call it, like Zoom bombing or something like that, where somebody can gain access to your Zoom room and, you know, push out malicious content or things like that. But, you know, now that we're in a virtual environment, those are things that we have to think about, where, you know, when we were in the office, we didn't really have those concerns. We just go down the hallway to the meeting room and meet there. And so once we're kind of like through the, you know, thinking, organizing, and preparing, then let's execute. So delivery, and then ongoing, let's monitor what's going on. So really kind of sticking to your playbook after you've, you know, done kind of an inventory of what resources we have. Are there any gaps between what we have and what we need in order to meet our financial and accounting reporting deadlines? And then just moving forward, after we've established that playbook, execute on that playbook, and really kind of monitoring our activities as they go along. So really kind of, we break it down into three separate priorities. We look at what's the delivery model. So in going from on-site to virtual. Then another priority is technology enablement. So do we have proper security in place? Home equipment that we may need, whether that's, you know, do we need to think about whether or not our employees should have allowances for printer scanning equipment so that they can do those sort of what you used to need to be in the office for, they can do those at home. Again, you know, talk about VPN, just validating the capacity, the provisioning, procedures against all the IT policies, that sort of thing. And then, you know, looking at the virtual closed schedule, what does the support desk look like if you have your own internal support, or if you have outsourced IT support? Does being remote either, you know, does it, you know, inhibit our ability to access support for IT? And then the third priority we look at is governance and compliance. So, you know, especially when you're talking with highly regulated industries, so in healthcare, if you have PHI, protected health information, on your local machine, do you have the necessary requirements to meet, you know, HIPAA, all those sort of standards? But really, like, again, it kind of gets back to companies need to assess what the real impact is, not just in the short term to, you know, kind of respond and continue to meet, you know, the deadlines that we have, but then think about, well, if we are in a prolonged remote working period, what are more things that we need to think about if this is kind of, I hate to use the bus term, but quote unquote, the new normal. So just thinking about this, not necessarily just short term and, you know, keeping our heads above water, but also thinking about this from a long-term perspective. And I guess to that point, Ashley, do you want to kind of cover, you know, what this might have from like a talent workforce perspective?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And I think that was a really great summary, both from Chris as well as Sarah and Katie, on what we could anticipate from a work of the future. And as I think about the future of the workforce, you know, I divide this really into work, workplace, and workforce. So, you know, I think we've talked a lot about how work has changed in these unprecedented times. But, you know, thinking more a little bit on the workforce itself, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, right? I mean, we went from, you know, us at Deloitte, we went from, you know, people traveling. Myself, I travel about 95% for my job. And so being home really is a different environment for me personally. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, Deloitte itself had over 55,000 US employees that went remote overnight. I think March 13th will forever resonate. Ironically, a Friday the 13th, not that I have triskaidekaphobia or something, but March 13th will forever have a monumental notion in my head that when the lights changed, and we went virtual overnight. But when we think about this workforce of the future, whether it be now within COVID or post-COVID, it's really thinking about, does this op model change of your workforce? So we have several clients that are right now assessing, if we're in virtual environments and they're working so successfully, then what's to say that this next normal, that we can't have our individuals working somewhere beyond a headquarters, for instance. So if you're headquartered in, say, Houston, Texas, as where I live, who's to say you can't acquire somebody from across the world, because of the fact that they'll be able to work remotely now, and we have figured out and we've overcome that hump. It's almost as though we accelerated this, because our trends over the years, our statistics have shown that remote workforce is really where it's at, and that's where we desire, especially from a Gen X, a Gen Y, as well as millennials, where they're desiring to be, is having a more remote workforce, or being able to have that flexibility in their work arrangements. So maybe not necessarily 100% remote, but at least having that opportunity of maybe having Fridays where they can work remotely, or even a staggered workforce, is what we're seeing in terms of how China has been implementing post-COVID. So, in China, or at least across Asia, they're right now starting to actually go back to work. And the environment is so different, obviously, from what we experience in the US, but, especially from their public transit standpoint. But nonetheless, they're actually staggering their workforce. So, we have folks that are going Monday and Wednesday, and Tuesday and Thursday. So it's, and then no one on Fridays, or, some sort of equivalent to that schedule. So you're seeing companies trying to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more open-minded in terms of how their workforce composition looks like, and how they work in the actual workplace, which takes me to workplace of the future. And really, what does this next normal look like in terms of the workplace? If we think about how history has dictated the workplace, in the early to late 80s, we experienced the cube farms, that we all know so well, and that we cringe at the thought of, office space notion of, listening to your neighbor eating sandwiches and talking loudly on the phone. And then we migrated and morphed into more of a collaborative space as we became more digitized. So through digitization, we now started incorporating more collaboration spaces. And as we start thinking more so in terms of how do we adapt the workplace to be more feasible for, as we're thinking culturally, and how folks now perceive being, distancing, in terms of social distancing from other coworkers, that may actually have to change too, to where we start seeing more of a hybrid model, of, we can't have a collaborative office space where, there's 15 people sitting at a conference room table. Instead, we'll need perhaps dividers, or, will individuals be wearing masks when they go back to work? And, now, for folks that have unfortunately been impacted by COVID-19, it's turned into their respiratory issues. So perfumes, and being mindful of perfumes and candles and different scents that exist throughout the workplace as well. So it's not just the actual social distancing of the chairs, but it's what people can smell and touch. And I think also too, when we think about the future, we also have to think about, in terms of balancing this next norm, is how do we keep our employees engaged and a sense of purpose? So, as we've been in these, this virtual environment where we're inundated with Zoom invites, and almost I kind of laugh that it's almost death by virtual meetings now. And our studies have already shown that meetings were already a problem, that people were having meetings to have meetings that could have been probably handled over phone calls or emails. So now you're seeing this inundation of more invites and unfortunately, this expectation that you have to be in a virtual environment. So, my encouragement, and this is what I've been implementing with my teams, and it's been quite successful, is gauging their vibes, trying to figure out what's a good balance, not having every single call be virtual, assessing whether or not the meeting is really necessary, and saying, you know what, like, yeah, I don't think this is necessary. Let's just handle this over email. Let's handle it over IM, or those other tools that, Sarah and Katie shared with us. Utilizing your tools to your advantage as opposed to defaulting to this virtual environment can be really impactful on how a person is feeling emotionally. And then I think also too is, not being afraid to have afternoons off, or, every once in a while, or thinking about having Friday afternoons off, or maybe all day on Friday of every other week, or, some sort of reward system to where people are getting away from their computer screens. And I mean, I feel personally where I have felt these situations where now that I'm in this more virtual environment, which ironically for me, I was traveling 95%, which meant I was virtual from a computer standpoint, but my clients were physically face to face. So now it's internally, I'm having invites as well as, or virtual invites. And now with my clients, I'm having virtual invites. So, it's working through both your team as well as even other stakeholders or your customers to make sure that how do you balance it? How do you make sure that, everyone feels at ease, giving time back to individuals and being cognizant of the notion that there's a lot of us that are dealing with, whether it's parents or family members, cohabitation much. I think that's a new norm for a lot of folks is, having to work in the same home with a significant other or spouse, and then children going through the wave of finishing their education for the school year. And of course, now that we've hit the May time frame, school is going to be ending soon. How do you keep your children engaged? I had a conversation with a close colleague of mine this morning, and he said, I just realized my children's camp just got canceled. I have no idea what I'm going to do with them for the summer. How do I keep them and decompress them? And it's because that's what camp does, right? Camp is a monumental thing that helps decompress your kids. So you got to think about creative means of not just yourself, but others and also those around you. And with that said, and this is my last thought before I open up for questions, is, think about your day in the sense of, your hours. So I personally think, and I've kind of surveyed my peers and have discovered that folks are starting to work more hours than what they previously worked. So for me personally, my days have started around 7 in the morning as I work with a lot of people from the East Coast. And I don't finish until about 8 o'clock at night because I deal with folks on the West Coast. And I'm having this, you got to have this constant concern of burnout. That how is that going to feel when you are sitting nonstop at your computer screen, staring into a little 1x1 camera with the little light, shining in your face? How does that help you mentally? You've got to decompress and you've got to set boundaries. So I highly recommend, as kind of one of those last takeaways before we open a Q&A, set those boundaries, set them with your team, be vocal, set those boundaries, be very cognizant of them, and keep them as your core principles and don't violate them, because the second you compromise once, you'll compromise again and again and again. And with that, I pass it back to Jody for Q&A.
Fantastic, such good information. We had a couple of questions that came over via email this morning, so we'll start with those. And this one really speaks to what Ashley was just talking about, and Katie has mentioned it a little bit too. I'm looking for ways to keep staff morale up. The longer this work remote situation goes on, the harder this is becoming. Everyone seems to be experiencing burnout and struggling to maintain work-life balance. So I know Ashley just gave us some tips on that. Any other thoughts on that burnout and morale without over Zooming people or death by Zoom meeting?
Right. I'll go ahead on that one. Yeah, I would. So it's you know, to Ashley's point about people working more hours, I have absolutely seen that. Again, having just done update calls with all of my staff, most of them, or a lot of them, just similar to myself, and even to Ashley's point, I start working earlier. I'm around more. I might actually be at my desk. Sometimes I might be there more than I have ever been, maybe, but I'm taking these little breaks. And so I get to the end of the day and I'm like, I don't know. My whole day is gone. I didn't 100% work the whole time. I am working more. And so I have really been encouraging people to, you know, specifically shut their computers down, turn it off, and as opposed to leave it on overnight. You have to shut it down to walk away. If you leave it on, it's so easy to just go hop on real quick. And then you don't feel like you get that break. And it's so important, I believe, to take that moment to get away. Even last Friday, it was nice outside. Never, when I was in the office, did I look outside and think, oh, it's so nice. I'm just going to leave I shouldn't say never. That's not true. I'm sure it happened. But on Friday, my office the window's right outside, and my husband and kids were outside the window and I could see them, and I just couldn't do it. I just decided on Friday afternoon I was done. And I don't think anyone faulted me for it. And I felt come Monday morning, I shut my computer down, was off for the weekend. On Monday, I felt amazing. So I think understanding that, and I think as a manager over staff, kind of encouraged to make sure they don't burn out. It's a little different than what we maybe historically have done, and really trying to push the balance. But I do think it's important. And we have internally, we've started doing little check-ins. Maybe before we would have staff that would go out to lunch together. And now they're doing, again, it's Zoom, but maybe with or without a camera, little calls where they would do a virtual lunch where they're eating together in a different place, but just to talk about the same kind of stuff you would if you went to lunch. So they still have that personal touch with people as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add here is 2 points. Is one, I have a client that's going through a system implementation right now, which I think is by far the most fascinating thing on the face of the earth. It's one thing to have your daily roles and responsibilities, but it's a totally new ballgame when you have that on top of a system implementation. And we were talking yesterday, and this was about, I think it was around 6 o'clock Eastern time, which was post business hours, right? And they were saying, we're scared of burnout. These folks are chomping at the bit. They're grinding, like we gotta get them to decompress. And like, we've been doing virtual happy hours, which I highly recommend. I think the breakout idea on Zoom is a phenomenal way of getting people to engage with each other that perhaps haven't previously. Not being afraid to have a cocktail hour. Like, it's not a taboo to be drinking. Obviously, day drinking is a taboo, but but being able to drink with your colleagues over Zoom, and hey, what are you drinking? Oh, you like whiskey? Oh, and it's a commonality. You start talking about something non-work related. So having those virtual happy hours that are not work related, making sure that you talk about something else. And then the second piece is, I had a team that has been trying to do different ideas, like a mixology class or a cooking class, which by far was the most entertaining I think I've ever seen, especially when none of us are very good at cooking. But although it's a skill set we're all trying to overcome given the situation. So, keeping different levels of engagement that don't deal with work, but keeping the momentum. But the implementation crew, we came up with a strategy to give them next Friday off. And we're going to set an all-day invite to where it blocks their calendar. No one can hopefully schedule on top of it, and let everyone take the day off. They've been working crazy hours, so let it be, right?
We've had some other, I'm looking at the questions, but just to add to that, aside from, we do absolutely happy hours, and we also did going along with the Zoom rooms or team rooms, kind of game rooms. So one might be a trivia room on Harry Potter facts. One might be, just a room where they're talking about some historical, since all the sports are canceled right now, but some historical sporting event, or, we have, this isn't through the office, but there's Yahtzee that people are playing over Zoom. So there's lots of games, I think, that you can play over Zoom or some other video means that are really fun. And then the other thing we've started doing internally is over Yammer. So it's more like like a chat posting Facebook, internal Facebook thing. Obviously, again, I'm not a tech person, so I'm sure there's a way better way to phrase that. But we use that, and I feel like I'm actually learning more about the team members than I did when I would go out to lunch with them, because their dogs are popping in or they're showing me, you know, whatever they're posting on there. And it's really been interesting because it's a different type of connection.
Yeah, I just will comment, because on that, we have theme days. And so what Sarah's referring to on the Yammer, there will be a theme day, like show us what you're eating that day, or what does your homemade stand-up desk look like, or you know, the pet, your coworkers. And we've been posting pictures that way. And I would say, in addition to the happy hours and the game rooms, in our teams, we allow, at least in my department, we have a departmental team that's kind of, it's both for work and there's a lot of chit chat stuff, but the gifts and the memes that are in there, that brings out someone's personality when they pick the picture that is what they're feeling or what they want to reply. And that has been, for me, that's been really enjoyable, getting to see what their sense of humors are from that perspective. So.
Oh yeah, and like the use of Snap Camera in Zoom. If you don't know what Snap Camera is, search it. It'll be, I'm seeing some smiles, so others know about this. It's owned by Snapchat, and it's like a little embedded tool that you can use in your Zoom. And I had a friend of mine who I did not realize her mother had COVID during the call, and we were, talking about, the situation and everything like that. And she messaged me afterwards, and obviously she told it during the story during the virtual happy hour, but she was like, I'm so glad that like you went creative and just like did snap cameras. I mean, I turned myself into Visa Bacon, like, there was some fun stuff. And she was like, this was the first laugh that I've gotten in the last 3 days. And you have no idea how much this meant to me. So, laughter can go a long way during these difficult times.
We have we've got some questions coming in on the chat, so we'll kind of run through these and then we'll come back to the email ones if we've got some time. Eric asks, as the role of finance has evolved past transactional to advisory, do you have recommendations to gain buy-in from leadership of smaller businesses to incorporate virtual work in their business continuity plan, or just their culture in general?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. So I work with companies a lot, standing up centers for analytics. And this is one area where, especially when you're talking about smaller businesses, I would say that, majority of companies that I work with that are, under $1 billion in revenue, don't have, an existing analytics center or capabilities around analytics that are more robust than, say, what you can do in Excel or, potentially even Microsoft Power BI or something like that. And this is a very difficult issue for a lot of businesses because the traditional view of finance and accounting has been, hey, this is all hindsight analysis, right? We're not adding value, quote unquote, to the organization. We're just essentially keeping tally of what do we have currently. So changing that focus of accounting and finance is definitely something that is a very, very hot topic. I would say prior to COVID, but now that, COVID has like pushed this remote environment, this becomes an even more important issue. So changing the focus of finance and accounting to like, we're not just looking hindsight, we're actually providing valuable input into business decisions. I think technologies like, or, really kind of like technologies around analytics and visualizations are a big push on that. But how do you gain buy-in? The biggest thing is you have to show value, right? And so how do you derive value from those data sets? And how do you show that, providing predictive analysis using historic information for future decisions, how can you accomplish that? I would say that a challenge that a lot of organizations run into is just the talent aspect. So the traditional kind of accountant, if you were to look back even, say like 10 years. So I graduated undergrad in 2010. My skill set when I graduated with is completely different than the skill set of the accounting and finance major that are coming out of colleges right now, which it should be. Same thing if we think about the CPA exam, the level of analysis that is expected of like a newly minted CPA is different than when I completed my CPA exam. So, but that is like one of the key challenges is that, okay, talent, if you have an existing workforce, which might not be as, sort of like tech savvy or something like that, how do you retool that existing workforce? And then how do you change your hiring for the future? But getting buy-in is really all about demonstrating value. And so how you articulate that and the associated costs with standing up a center of analytics or something like that can be a bit of a challenge. But I think, the biggest thing is one, educate the stakeholders in the first place. So show what, analytics are, what analytics are not, and looking at different other automation technologies, what those really look like. And then talking about, okay, yeah, there might be a cost associated with standing up these capabilities, but what does this mean for the organization in the future? It's not just about cost reduction going forward, it's about increasing revenues. So I would say that those are strategies generally that I kind of work with companies to sort of like change that focus.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add here in terms of business continuity is the fact that, I mean, the reality is we've all been impacted by this in one way, shape, or form, especially from small businesses. Small businesses have been very much impacted, perhaps probably more than others in a negative way. And I think showcasing that value brings into the notion of what if this were to happen again? Mm-hmm. And, we hear the rumbles and, I don't want to, to turn this into rumors, but the reality is we've been fighting coronavirus for years. This is just a different strand. Who is to say that another strand may come in the cusp of flu season come winter, which there have been speculations that there could be a second burst come winter. So, I think, in terms of showcasing value, it's correct. Yes, this is a black swan event, but what if there was another black swan event similar to this, or a different black swan event? And I think too, the reality of it is that the digital workforce is of the future. So we need to learn to embrace it. We've been saying this for the last 10 years that virtual work environments were going to be a bit of the future, but because of this has really accelerated it.
Mark asks, and this is probably kind of along the same lines, is there a difference between CPA firms, industry, and government? And I'm thinking in terms of, he's asking in terms of culture and, how the technology and kind of all the things we've been talking about, seeing how you guys work with obviously are in firms, but are working with industry or working with government. Are you seeing differences in how they're approaching this with their staff and what the expectations are?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a stab and then feel free to chime in. I think Chris gave a great example at the beginning about, more regulated and PII. If you're working more remotely, you definitely have to be more careful in terms of the data that is in your home and, not having it readily on your desk where children can use it as coloring sheets and whatnot. But, I think that's a great example of something that's different. And, I think the reality of the matter is every company has its own culture, how it reacts to COVID. And I'll turn a spin on this due to COVID. What we have seen as far as the firm goes, we've seen winners and we've seen the losers. And I hate to put it in that category, but, winners and losers of COVID. The ones that have been very profitable. So, companies that have made disinfectants and medications and whatnot. And those that, have been, the losers of the world, which have been, very much small businesses as well as, different perhaps consumer products companies, just to, thinking about like retail or something like that. But I think it's the notion of how do you become resilient from COVID and how you bounce back and how you thrive. And a lot of that is driven based on your culture and how you're taking care of your employees.
I agree with that. And I do think that I was chatting yesterday actually with some people from the state government just on an engagement that we're working on. And we were kind of reflecting on our virtual experiences. So I live in a very remote area, which is why I'm in the office today. I shouldn't say very remote. It doesn't seem as remote unless I'm trying to be on a live webinar with screen sharing. Then it seems like I'm in the middle of nowhere. But the man I was talking to on the phone, he is in government, and they've gone to just rotational. So the teams kind of decide what's best for them. But they absolutely are moving more virtual. They have been in conversations about, what software they need to get because they know they need to move to that next level. And thinking about, even in whether it's government, small business, nonprofits, whatever it is, he's appreciating the fact that at 5:30, he's not trying to get home back to his farm because he has a farm. At 5:30, he gets on his horse and he can ride. So I think, it doesn't matter whether you're in a big city and you see people making these changes, or you're in small communities where they never thought they'd have to do this. People like some aspects of just being home and not having to, I understand New York traffic isn't quite the same as Lansing traffic, but it's all perspective, right? So we all think it takes too long to get home, So I think it's going to affect everybody, regardless whether you're big city, government, anything.
That's great. Aaron asks, how do you suggest doing a decompression for hourly employees? How do you encourage them to step away?
I'll go at least to start. So I would say that our hourly employees are encouraged just as much as our salary employees. From our firm's perspective, at least Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they're still paid for the period of time when they are involved in our fun stuff. As long as it's a firm sponsored or whatever it might be. But other than that, it's the same long-term health perspective and making sure that they understand that they aren't going to be able to go all the time as well. And so making sure, you might think that you could handle it for a while, but eventually you are going to burn out, and just making sure that they are managing and paying attention to that as well.
Really
yeah, I would agree. I mean, if you think about it, an hourly employee is just as important as a full-time employee to an organization. And the root of why you're doing, say, some sort of social gathering or, some sort of virtual happy hour, et cetera, is because of the fact that you're wanting to focus on employee well-being to make sure that they have that plug in to well-being. And that they can be a more effective employee. If you strip them of that, you're bifurcating your staff, first of all, which creates a clash of culture. And then also you're showing less of an importance to their well-being. And at the end of the day, you want those hourly employees to be as efficient as possible. If you don't let them decompress, they're not going to be as efficient.
I think it's interesting too, because it's a good time to evaluate goals and how people are evaluated. If they're just given more money because they're working all these hours and grinding through projects, that's way different than say, okay, maybe we switch it, and maybe we, instead of giving all of this overtime, maybe we give incentive bonuses for maintaining realization of this, or for getting projects done timely or ahead of schedule or something like that. And then again, like Katie said, I think it's important to show them how you value, and we do absolutely. If there's fun things up to a level, if we have happy hour, we won't necessarily pay an hourly person for 5 hours of happy hour time, but we certainly encourage them to come, take a break, pay them for the first hour or two or something like that.
Great. Lorena asks, here's a scenario. Stay-at-home orders and social distancing guidelines are revoked. However, there are employees who are reluctant to return to the physical office due to health, safety, etc. issues. Can employers require staff to physically return? What solutions would you offer in this instance?
Yeah, I mean, I would offer up just really quick. I mean, one, I think there are, differing sort of regulations by state. So one, I would make sure that you're not sort of skirting any, laws or regulations around that. But two, I mean, I think, the perspective on working from home is definitely changing. Even if, tomorrow the stay-at-home orders, shelter in place were revoked, I don't necessarily see a 100% flight back to the office immediately. I think that, really, if anything, this has shown that a lot of folks can effectively perform in their role from a, remote location. And so, whether or not an employer can require someone to be in the office, well, I think that, in theory, yeah, you can require the employee to be wherever they need to be in order for them to do their job. Now, should you have that top-down mandate, I'd be a little bit sensitive about that. Just because, again, you need to think that, okay, Ashley gave the example from one of her colleagues that doesn't have summer camp, right? So if we have childcare, does your organization provide any assistance with that? So whether or not, it's through like a flexible spending plan through your, healthcare plan or something like that. But what is the real impact about, an employee coming back to the office, not just to health and safety, but also, what other responsibilities do they now have, because there might not be resources that they need for other home care items.
Mm-hmm. A couple more questions here, and then we're going to be winding down shortly. Wow, this hour went really fast. Another question from Erin, and I think we touched on the first part of her question about other ideas outside of happy hour, things like trivia and games, going into the Zoom rooms and kind of going that route. This afternoon, our staff is going to be doing movie clip trivia. We haven't done this one yet. We also did Pictionary via Zoom. You can share like a whiteboard, which is a lot of fun. So there are a lot of different digital options. But then she asks, how do you get your employees to engage in these games or theme days? We've tried that in our office, and out of 130 employees, we maybe got 10 to respond.
Yeah, I have a bit of a perspective on this. One is that that's almost symptomatic of the company culture, that perhaps that's not necessarily something that's in alignment with the culture. So you almost have to kind of shift the perspective. So I think one is getting leadership involved. So those managers, supervisors, getting them excited about it carries a lot of weight from setting that tone. And then I think the second piece here too is gamification carries a lot of weight. And I don't know about you guys, but I love some bragging rights. So, I would heavily recommend, putting some sort of gamification aspect to it to, break it down, whether it's, different departments against each other, or, having some sort of way of bifurcating or even randomizing it. I know we did that for one of our Houston happy hours within advisory, and it was really quite successful whenever you just randomized. You get to network with individuals that are not in your group, and you also get to have bragging rights.
I think it's also helpful if you start with kind of smaller teams. So I absolutely agree. But when we have 140, and it's tough to get 140 people engaged. But if you maybe break it down by service line or team or department or something like that, and they start to change the culture, then I think it helps change everything. You can see I'm juggling. You've seen a little person kind of pop in and out.
New coworkers. We all have new coworkers.
It's fitting for today's conversation.
Absolutely. Flexibility. I know that you went back and we did touch on the rural area versus urban areas. But Mark asked too about, and I'm not sure if off the top of your head if you guys will know this, but minimal text speeds up and down. He said, for example, he was using AT&T DSL, which was good enough for 4K streaming, and had to go to Charter. Anybody ideas on the minimal text speeds to support all of the technology that is so mandatory right now?
Yeah, I no perspective here beyond, I appreciate the fact that, Mark lives in a small rural area. Living in Houston, we actually have fiber. So when we went under the mandatory work from home, I said, this is going to be easy. This is going to be a breeze, because I've got this. And I have had connection speed issues. So, sometimes it's not necessarily about like, ooh, you have fancy new fiber. It's about how many people are on it.
Yeah. We did have one more question over email, if we can squeeze this one in. It has to do with training. Of course, I backed away from it. Here it is. Any advice on how to train new staff members or young CPAs In the past, there was more job shadowing, sitting down with them and showing them how to do things. How do we do this in a remote environment? It's been tough to keep new staff busy.
I
Yeah.
would,
Go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say, so we have several staff that are getting ready to onboard, and we have onboarded a couple of people. It was kind of funny. So we had 2 full-time techs, people go remote in the fall. And since then we have hired 2 individuals that are full-time. One's in Wisconsin and one is in Seattle, I think is the other one. So, you know, we are now training these new people from all over the place. And there's a few pieces to it, at least from my perspective. One of them is setting up individual calls with that person one-on-one with other people on the team, so they get that face-to-face time. You know, you still would have had that if you were in the office, but we don't want to take that away and have this name. Now you have an individual that, you know, you recognize the name, but you've never talked to that person. You don't stop by and see them. So we've been setting up a lot of those ahead of time. And then additionally, we do, again, back to the technology, we share screens. Our training is a lot. So job shadowing through sharing a screen is, you know, almost just as similar. In fact, I hate to admit that every once in a while, if I'm in the office and there's someone at the farthest end of the other office, instead of walking over there and they would call with a question, I would share my screen at that time. So from that perspective, again, Teams and Skype, I know you can share screen. I'm sure there's other apps that you can do it that way as well. But we still have, from a training, and even I've got a call with a client next week. And whereas I normally would have that person come in and maybe sit silently in the room with me while they can hear this interaction, I'm just going to have her join the conference call, and I'm going to let the client know, you know, that they're on, from a training perspective, they're here to learn. And clients have always understood and managed, you know, they're okay with that anyway. So we're trying to keep things as normal as possible. I know Zoom fatigue is a real thing. There's some article about how you only see this much of a person, and, you know, you don't get to see all their whole personality, but trying to maintain what it would have been like. It's different, but we've been working through it so far, at least. So
yeah, Katie, I think those are really great points. You know, I think the only thing that I would add is mentoring and the onboarding process and coaching is more important than ever right now. And fostering that sense of community, especially for new hires right now, is going to be critical. And, you know, fostering that sense of value and, you know, purpose